was a long train that passed my way, and I had to wait for probably 5-10 minutes. It seemed like lots of minerals were being shipped out to keep Australia moving and going. Epicenter of the economic boom, I believe, just inland from here. Is that true? Consequently, it's sort of the it's a predecessor to development of the coast, because everybody's attracted to the coast, and there are a lot, as Ashley said, there are a lot of parallels with the Great Ocean Road in Victoria that runs west of Victoria. That's older, of course. That was established in the 30s, but over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a massive amount of development. A lot of new development, older houses being demolished, land values have skyrocketed. People from mostly Melbourne moving in, buying property, houses, demolishing them, then building what are often pretty inappropriate, or what residents consider inappropriate development. So I'm going to start off talking about that particular study. That was a 4-year study that was mostly funded by the federal government, by a Australian Research Council grant, because they were, the federal government was concerned about so many people complaining that the character of these beautiful coastal towns was being destroyed, and what could be done about it as far from a planning perspective. But I might just, let me see what I got here. I might just start off with talking about some of the rationale for this study. Was that many of these coastal towns are under pressure from not only tourism, which has been happening for a long time, but this what's been termed here the sea change phenomena. People from the city moving to these coastal towns for their amenity values. And there's been quite a bit of work done, well, there's been a little work done on categorizing the types of communities that are being impacted, these so-called sea change settlement types. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But they're under increasing pressure. And that means the planners in the councils are under increasing pressure to be able to control this development. And one of the things that residents, in fact, studies I've done in New South Wales and Queensland and even overseas, one of the things that keeps recurring is people say the character of our town is being lost. That's kind of a slippery term. It's kind of hard to define, the character of a place. So I set out to try to understand what people, these are residents, not expert planners or architects or landscape architects thought character was, but what the people that experience the change and who are complaining that the character is being lost, how they conceptualize it or experience it. So I set out to look at various, I looked at 7 Great Ocean Road sea change communities, and I'll talk about how I selected those, that are being impacted, where individuals are talking about the loss of character of their town, distinctive character, which is desirable to people, not only at the town level, but at the neighborhood level, particularly at the neighborhood level. And in Victoria, the planning code, we have it's called Res Code. It mandates that local councils, local authorities, must assess new residential development on its impact on neighborhood character. So that's the concept I was looking at. And what most people, you'll see through the presentation, but people talk about inappropriate development. So I set out to look at what do people mean by character, what do they mean by degradation of character, or what's being lost, and what do they mean by inappropriate development? Because it turns out that it's the development that's not controlled properly, that's the biggest impact. So as I mentioned, in Victoria, the state planning code, Res Code, has various planning policies within it, but this one about neighborhood character is probably one of the most trickiest for planners to get their heads around. Typically, the way a council will take a town, so I'll back up a minute. In response to Res Code and the mandate from the state government, local councils have to revise their planning schemes in order to respond to this Res Code directive about neighborhood character. Typically what they do is they commission urban designers, architects, planners, landscape architects, design professionals, design and planning professionals, to engage in studies to identify what are the features that support the character of the place at the neighborhood level and the town level and even the regional level, and then what's detracting from that. But there's the expert opinion, this expert opinion isn't always congruent with what the local residents feel. And I think a lot of places I've spoken, people go, you know, this resonates with them. They go, that's right. What's being approved is not what we think is compatible with the character. So my position from an academic point of view and research point of view is that you really have to look at the experience and the knowledge of the local residents, because they've witnessed the evolution and the changes over time. And with these sea change communities, that's happened very rapidly. So that's my, you know, I'm criticized by a lot of my colleagues that sort of maintain that, oh, because we're experts and our training gives us this expertise, we're the ones that should be determining what character is and what should be preserved, what should be allowed. I disagree with that. And there's some research colleagues of mine overseas have done, I just listed a couple there, that often what professional designers and planners, how they assess character and other perceptual dimensions is often incongruent with local communities' perceptions. So my position is that the local residents are the true experts. Now, the trick is, how do you get that information and then translate that into a planning scheme, planning regulations, controls? That's the trick. And my background, I might mention, is in environmental planning and design, urban design, environmental planning, landscape architecture, but environmental psychology too. So I mix those two. So the methods that I'm going to show you come more from social science, environmental psychology perspective, in order to try to tease out what people think defines character of place, or sense of place, being called. So I might just put it in context. This particular study that was done at the University of Sydney, Meeting the Sea Change Challenge, Best Practice Models for Local and Regional Planning for Sea Change Communities. Again, that was a federal government commissioned project or study. It was actually 2 reports that started identifying these issues that were happening all across the country. And I mentioned in my book there that it's happening all around the world, particularly near major metropolitan areas that sort of are expanding along the coast for the amenity values that the coast can give. So what they did that I actually sort of found very useful is they categorized these sea change type communities into these 5. Commuter settlements, which are communities that are close enough to a major metropolitan area where people can live in the coastal town and commute. That'd probably be closer to Perth in this case, you know. Gateway settlements, small to medium-sized towns that are about 3 or 4 hours drive. It might vary depending upon what people, the location of settlements compared to the major metropolitan area. But in Victoria, on the Great Ocean Road, we're talking about a 3-hour drive, 2 to 3 hour drive, places like Lorne, Anglesey, Apollo Bay. Regional cities, I'm not as familiar with Western Australia as Victoria, but in Victoria, sort of the culmination of the Great Ocean Road is a regional city called Warrnambool. So there are these regional cities on the coast, and they're experiencing this sea change phenomena as well. And then lifestyle destinations, and this is, I asterisk the ones that the types of communities that I've been looking at. Lifestyle destinations are predominantly tourism, second homes, summer homes. That's the kind of sea change impact that's happening. And then the smaller, more remote hamlets, areas often surrounded by natural landscapes, often protected, national parks or whatever. A case that I'll show you here, in fact, I should switch to that. Well, no. A case that one of the study areas that I was looking at is Port Campbell, which has a population of about 400, less than 400, but it gets massive amounts of tourists because very close to it is the 12 Apostles and all those coastal geologic rock formations. So it's a high international tourism value, but a very small community. But people have been moving there for that, the amenity values there. So the types of threats that the sea change phenomena really result in are both in the natural environment and community well-being. And in the natural environment, which I'm not going to talk about as much, but obviously they're related. The new development impacts on the natural environment, and then that has impacts on people's perception of the environmental quality or the sense of place. So one of the things that I found here and a lot around the world is coastal wetlands are being degraded through development and filled in. I come from the U.S., you can probably tell by the accent, and when I worked professionally in the U.S., we had to respond in doing master planning or design development projects to inland wetland legislation, the federal, state, and local levels. It's mandatory. And so I'm very sensitive to the fact that wetlands are being obliterated. If you don't have if you don't have conservation controls on wetlands, particularly coastal wetlands, they're going to be lost due to this development, and they have high ecological value, high biodiversity. So they're very important to preserve. In general, habitat loss and fragmentation due to the development is a problem. Hydrologic systems get messed up, so water that falls doesn't percolate into the aquifers, into the soil. You get more impervious surface, and that then causes problems, erosion, but also problems with marine habitats. You get siltation and pollution coming from paved areas. And erosion is a big problem. And then introduction of exotic plants and animal species. So you get people, typically it's people moving from the city to these towns, and typically it's people that are more affluent. They can afford to buy into this sea change phenomena. And often with that comes the new development comes introduction of exotic plants and animals. And then now climate change, responding to climate change, while it's quite hard to predict the impacts around the world, everybody's, and myself included, are starting to grapple with how we can adapt to a climate changed world. And coastal settlements are at they're at the forefront of this. If you look at Brisbane and the recent floods, everywhere it's happening that we're getting more frequent floods, more intense, And then longer, more gradual impacts will be sea level rise, which again is quite unpredictable. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, international group of scientists, about 2,700 of them, the signatures of that and contributed to that say about 1.8 meter over until 2100. Some scientists are saying much, much more, up to 25 meters, if certain tipping points. I'm not talking about that now, but coastal towns are probably at the most vulnerable to these impacts, and they have to think about how development might affect that and be exposed to it as well. Then community well-being. While I'm not going to talk about a lot of social dimensions, I do want to mention that in this study I found that there was some very troubling social impacts. One was this polarization between the wealthy newcomers, typically wealthy, not always, and the existing residents, and particularly people that are least able to change their lifestyles, the elderly, people growing up in the town that have roots there can't afford to buy houses anymore, so there's an economic polarization, and that causes a social. Then this gentrification, and it's linked to that. Then the transience of populations too, people coming in for the weekend or for the summer, and then you lay tourism on top of that, which is, at least in Victoria, is very transient. It's during the summer. So the streets are clogged, the services, the restaurants, the supermarkets are just packed during the summer. During the winter, it's dead. So businesses can't maintain. But also, one of the troubling things that happens is the sense of community, which has been called sense of community, is being lost as a result. So in all of those towns, I looked at 7 towns, and talking to people, they're saying, well, that house next door, nobody lives there except on, maybe a month a year or on weekends. That house is abandoned. But then we have kids, and the kids have nobody to play with. There's nobody to provide mutual support. In a typical neighborhood, that's what you get. Mothers will say, hey, you watch my kids and I'll watch yours. And then, so that sort of sense of community is lost. So that's why I actually think this concept of neighborhood character is quite important. Bring it down to the scale of the neighborhood, because then you start to encompass some of this sense of community, which I actually found was a big part of character. Harder to control from a planning point of view, but nonetheless, it's an important. And then the thing that I was looking at a lot was the amenity values, and it's principally due to unsympathetic development, but also destruction of the natural environment and lack of conservation of heritage features. So the impacts. I think I sort of spoke about this, but residential subdivisions, taking particularly agricultural land and subdividing it for residential, because then you get a big impact, threatening the distinctive character of these towns. And this is a quote from that Meeting the Sea Change Challenge report, where they actually cite some of my earlier work. This was a study that I did in Airlie Beach in Queensland, which was being impacted by tourism very rapidly, and the council wanted to put in some development controls to try to control it. And they're talking about local characters or sense of place in these smaller communities as being overwhelmed by the scale and the pace, 2 important characteristics, the size of the development, how fast it's occurring. But there's a lack of planning tools to really deal with this. The traditional tools, like I said, are usually based on expert opinion, and it's possible that might, I can guarantee you that isn't always congruent with how the communities want to see it. The challenge then is to devise ways, set of planning tools, that will allow us to first define what people mean by the character of the place and the attributes, the features of it, so that you can control the change. My conclusion is the change is going to happen anyway. You have to control it. And that's where the planning comes in. And I took this from this is a cartoonist from San Francisco in the late 60s, a guy named Robert Crumb. He did a lot of interesting art back then. But he did this poster. It's a big poster. And I got permission to put it in the book because I thought it really encapsulated what happens with this process of change in place character. And he actually calls this a short history of America. But I thought it really encapsulated it, where you have this rural landscape. You get some small development happening. There's still that sense of community. Pretty soon you start to get urban sprawl, and then I would say urban chaos. And that's happening to a lot of these coastal towns. Without controls, that's what will happen. So my research aims were to explore how town and neighborhood character are experienced by the local residents, develop a methodology for being able to do that, because it's not that easy. It's not simple, because while you might say, I really like the character of this place, or I feel the character's being lost, it's kind of hard for us to just put our finger on exactly what it is. So I was working up a methodology and testing that methodology to figure out how people understand that change. And then, importantly, identify relationships between the kinds of physical attributes that you can control through planning and community perceptions of local character, which you can then implement or use to inform planning control, development of planning controls, plus preservation of local character, how you can preserve it. And understand how people understand it at different scales. Is there a difference when you go from the neighborhood scale to the whole town to the region? And how do those different scales nest together and the links between those? It's quite a big topic, and that's so what I was really looking at is these 7 towns. Melbourne is about 100K that way. There's the city of Geelong, so I think it's about 70K from Geelong to Melbourne. So you see it's in striking distance, and there's almost all of that hinterland there. A lot of that hinterland, particularly in here and over there, is national park so preserved national forests. And then along here is the marine park, where the 12 Apostles and all of those geologic features of internationally importance. So these are the towns, starting at Torquay, Anglesey, Aries Inlet, Lorne, Apollo Bay, Port Campbell, Port Fairy. And I selected these for various reasons. One was population sizes, so that I could start to capture those different sea change settlement types. So the different types, distance from Melbourne, how far you have to drive. It's going to make a difference. If you're close, you could commute to work. If you're further away, say Port Fairy is the furthest, it's about a 4-hour drive. Much less likely you're going to pop down there for the weekend. So that has, and then population sizes. So Port Campbell, as I said, was about 400. Torquay was over 10,000. It's about 10,000. So you've got some differences that capture those different settlement types. So data collection. I won't get too into this because this could be a whole lecture in itself. But as I said, it's actually kind of tricky to figure out how a community conceptualizes the character of a place or neighborhood, and then figure out how much agreement there is with that. Because if you just hold a town meeting and say, what's the character of the place? What should we preserve? You tend to get people that are very comfortable with speaking and very verbose, and they go, no, should be at this. you tend to then also get people that don't say anything but might have very salient, very good observations. For instance, the elderly and children, they don't necessarily, they're not going to get up and be very verbose and state their opinion, but they might, you know. And I'm basing this on a very egalitarian, democratic kind of way of doing this, that everybody should have the chance to help define that, so that then the planning regulations are not just based or formulated on those that have the strongest voice or the most money. So, so these are the kind of techniques I've used, and I've developed these over years, for about 15 years now. I actually did my PhD dissertation about 15 years ago on developing methodology to do this, and it's evolved and been refined over the years. Projective mapping. I send out maps of the towns to everybody in the town. So it's a census approach, mail survey, but everybody gets it, so that everybody has a chance. With mail surveys, you don't always get a very high response rate, but at least you can say everybody had the chance to respond. I think that's important. And what I ask people to do is to identify on those maps where they would take, where are those features they feel are most important to the character of the town, and conversely, where are those features, what are those features they feel are most impacting or detrimental to that. And then I ask them to do it, to draw a circle around their neighborhood, what they consider their neighborhood, which is a whole study in itself, is how people conceptualize their neighborhood, and then what are the features at the neighborhood level that both contribute and detract. Got thousands of, close to 2,000 across the 7 towns, which is pretty good samples, you know, and then documented the most frequently mentioned features in each town, both positive and negative sense. Photographic documentation. So, and I also asked people in this, I said, if you were going to take a photograph of these features, where would you take it from and what would you include in it? So we had some idea. I actually hired a photographer, a landscape architect / photographer, and she read through all of these for each of the you know, sort of features that, not every feature, but the ones we photographically documented that were mentioned quite a, you know, a frequency of times, to try to document these, not as, they weren't meant to be artistic photographs. They're meant to document what people meant by, oh, this building from here with those trees around it, you know, or whatever. So there were many, many variations on it. That took a long time. Photo ranking or photo rating workshops. What we did then is, in each town, took the most frequently mentioned attributes that were contributing and then detracting from the character, put those in a PowerPoint presentation like this, randomly, just mixed them up. And we also used the labels that people identified these features as, so that they were sort of a jog to people's memory. And then in a previous study, this was, oops, it fell off there, but I wrote an article, this is a work I did in Byron Bay up in New South Wales when it was changing. I wrote an article for the, on that study for the Australian Planner. It's a journal for Australian planning. And in that study, I identified these various dimensions. The most important was, is it compatible or incompatible with the character? That's how people see it. But related to that was, is it distinctive or common? Is it distinctive to the place? So there's a high correlation between that. Is it natural or artificial? You know, and there were a whole list of other attributes that were correlated with this notion of character. But it turns out character is the most important one. Focus groups using stimuli photographs. So from the workshops, where there were between 68 and 109 features of the town that there was sort of a consensus on, were shown to people. They rated them on this quantitative bipolar scales, sort of a highly compatible with character, highly incompatible, and then those other scales as well. Once I got the results back, you can get mean and standard deviation, average scores, and standard deviation measures the degree of variation in how much people assess these. I got focus groups. I got people from the different neighborhoods, and I showed them the results. Only with development, because new development was the thing that was identified, you'll see, as the most impacting on the character. So I showed them development by neighborhoods, and I said, okay, this is how your fellow residents, the community assess these. And these are the scores. And I put the ones that were considered the most compatible to the least by neighborhoods. And then in focus groups, you sort of facilitate a conversation. You use that as stimuli, and you say, and I just brought it back to them. I said, what is it about that development that everybody says is so out of character? What's causing that? And likewise, what are the things about this one that people think fit in, is quite compatible? You get a lot of answers, you get a lot of discussion, but what I was really looking for, what are the attributes? What did they mention? And then when you collapse that across all of the different developments, and you'll see that there's recurring attributes that are identified. And then I did something else, which again I'll have to. It's kind of complex, but multiple photo sorting technique and interviews. I actually took sets of these features, the same ones I used in the workshop, went back to individuals and had them sort them by similarity, and then I probed them, like with the open-ended questioning, what is it about those that are similar? So you'll see the results. It's quite an interesting technique. We can get quantitative and qualitative data. Look, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but these are different forms of analyses of those. So content analysis of the open-ended stuff, the frequency that people mention stuff. Obviously, the more frequently something's mentioned, you can assume that it's probably important. Descriptive statistics, just means, standard deviations, correlations, things like that. Multidimensional scaling, that's one of the ways you analyze the photo sorting. Same with categorical principal component analysis. Then I was also interested to look to see if there were differences with length of residency, which is kind of a way of measuring familiarity with a place. If you've lived in a place a long time, you probably, it sort of goes to, it's realistic to assume that you're more familiar with it. Also, I looked at environmental history variables, particularly where people grew up. They grew up in a small town or a rural area, a large city, and so I was interested in, and that also is familiarity, because it's a familiarity with the type of settlement. So if you grew up in Sydney and moved to a small coastal town somewhere, on the coast of New South Wales or wherever, you might be more tolerant of changes that somebody that grew up in a small town might not be. So that was the hypothesis. And then principal component analysis, which is I looked at how people describe their neighborhoods. I won't talk a lot about that, but that turned out to be very interesting. These are sample sizes, so you can see that in the larger towns, I got more respondents from the projective mapping mail surveys, which makes sense. You do tend to get higher responses with people that have more education, older people are more concerned than you do sort of younger people. So that was, but there were pretty good representations. When you looked at the census data compared to what the profile of the respondents was, it was pretty good. And then the rating workshops, smaller samples, but still it gave me pretty good information, and you see that there was very strong agreement amongst people, which we could measure. I didn't do focus groups in every town because I started getting the exact same kinds of attributes, and I said, well, I think that sort of nails it. So if you look at that, that was the total, 1,878 was total respondents, and 604 were the amount of features that were identified and assessed. So I'm just going to show you one dimension of the results, okay? So for each town, I was able to construct this sort of, how can you say, it's a progression of elements that were identified by the community most frequently, rated according to their compatibility with the character of the town as they knew it, and then I assembled those in ascending order. So if you see, and this number here, these numbers, M means mean, or the average score, and standard deviation is the measure of how much variation between people. So in these cases, 1 and 0 means everybody in the group said, this is absolutely part of the character, this is iconic of, and this is Aries Inlet, one of the smaller towns. So you see, there's something happening there. All the ones that people say are absolute, there's absolute agreement on it, and they rate it the highest. They're all natural features. There's no development at all visible in those. And, some wildlife, kangaroos and the gang cockatoo, but then you start to get a little bit of built features, but they're still quite naturalistic. And what you'll see, I was able to put these into typologies. What I call that is access to nature. And that came out to be very strong from the community level. And then you start to get heritage features. There's another access to nature. Then you start to get these historic features, iconic landmark features like White House, historic buildings. Then it's not until about here. So on a scale of 1 to 7, on a compatibility scale, 4 would be neutral. So anything less than 4 means that to some extent people considered that really contributing to the character. Anything between 4 and 7, out of character to an extent. And then, so if you look at that one, that's still 1.25 means that people are still agreeing very much that this is part of the character, but they say it's 2.5. So it's sort of moderately part of the character. So that's the first new development you get, and there are certain attributes about that I wanted. So when you start to see that over and over, you want to explore it. But I wanted to explore it from the perspective of the community, so that hence the focus groups. You see some vernacular architecture. Interesting, these kinds of developments, this is the general store in the town. And architecturally, not that interesting. Pretty dilapidated and everything, but it's the social dimension was really important. Everybody picks up their mail there. Everybody goes and gets some coffee or gets the newspaper there. They meet. So you see that still, it's still sort of moderately to a bit in character. You get some new development. Interesting. That's what I was particularly interested in, things like this and this, because they're new, and yet people said, yeah, these fit in. These are pretty compatible with the character. And there was actually pretty strong agreement in that, low standard deviation. Then, then we start in that progression, anything over 4, a little bit out of character. So what we have here is slightly out of character on the top, and then as it goes down, you start to get, so if you consider 7 the worst, 6.07 and very strong agreement in that means that people really think these things are inappropriate. They're not, and yet they were approved and they were built, and incrementally they were degrading the character. And so this is just one town. There's a lot in that. This one's iconic, the pole house they call it, and that was interesting because in most cases, distinctiveness was very strongly related to how much people rated something as in character or out of character. More distinctive, the more in character. This one actually was rated as very distinctive, but not particularly in character. So there are instances. There were comments in the focus group like, one is enough. We don't want to see any more like that. So then I'll show you another town too where you can see the same pattern. That was the interesting thing. Across all 7 towns, there was a remarkable pattern in the types of features that were identified. So I could put those into typologies. But the focus groups, so this is Anglesey. Just one development that was rated, I just picked one to show here, but obviously there were many, that was rated actually as quite compatible with the character. It sort of probably has a score of 2.5, and strong agreements. And then one that was rated as quite out of character. And then this is the results of the content analysis of what people said about that in the focus groups. Okay, the colors they felt helped it blend in. It was set in vegetation, particularly indigenous species, and it was screened by the vegetation. The roof design reflected historical precedents of some of the heritage buildings that had been left. A lot of these towns, the heritage features had been destroyed by fires. Ash Wednesday fire took out a lot, and previous ones as well. Timber construction, small footprint, low rise, like not very high, and no fencing on the front or side yards to break up the sort of continuity of the landscape. In contrast, this one, people said, it's really boxy. And that term boxy and monolithic kept coming up, and you'll see it has fencing, as compared to that doesn't. No vegetation between the buildings. Actually, since then, the landscape has grown up, and I pretty much predict if you did it again, it wouldn't be rated quite as badly. It looks quite urban in character, unfinished look, has no eaves or overhang. The surface articulation was one of the things that came out that there should be. Visually dominates the streets. It's too close to the street, not enough surface articulation, in other words, a blank wall. Repetitive design, and it's not distinctive. It could be anywhere. And that one, obviously, with this correlation between character compatibility and distinctiveness, well, this one rated as very common, not very distinctive. Yep, sure. Okay, so when you take all of those attributes across all the neighborhoods, all the different groups in this particular town, you start to and you content analyze that. You see the most frequently mentioned across all the different developments. Screened by vegetation came out as the most, particularly indigenous species. Small in scale and height and mass. Colors that were warm, earthy, muted, natural. Larger setbacks, larger land without fence. Good landscape design. Gravel and other natural materials for driveways so you don't get the white concrete contrasting. Structures that reflect the historic precedents. Not higher than the tree canopy. That was very important. Wherever the tree canopy was, if you had buildings that went above that, people started to identify those as being out of character. So what I was seeing is if it's subordinate to the landscape or blends into the landscape, that was considered to be more in character. Visually obvious from roads. So those are positive, not visually obvious. And then a harmonious mix of architectural forms with moderate complexity. Then you look on the other side, The negative attributes, the most frequently mentioned was the size. These boxy, what has been called McMansions. You know, people buy the land, and for some reason, I know I only have 10 minutes here, but have to say some of the anecdotal things. People will be complaining about, oh, the size of these houses are horrible, and then you look at their house, and they've just built this giant McMansion, and they just a guy and his wife, they don't have any kids, just because they can, and they're complaining about somebody building the same kind of development below them because it's ruining the character of the town, you know. So is this sort of individual ownership as compared to the public good, and that was an interesting thing. Hodgepodge of colors, so which lack of harmony, lack of vegetation for screening, and particularly exotic vegetation, high density, clipped lawns. So I just want to now really quickly show you, there's another town, Lorne. The same patterns, natural features, then you start to get some heritage features. You get shoreline, foreshore kind of recreational activities that came out really strongly. And then the same kinds of attributes that the people were picking out. Big, boxy, no screening, very dominant. Now, the multidimensional scaling, it allowed me to, and the photo sorting, it allowed me to categorize the features and to see the underlying perceptual dimensions. So if you look at that group of features, these are just an example of that, very high scores. They're all natural features, very high compatibility. They also, people agreed on it very much. They're down there. If you look at that like a map, that's, say, that's Western Australia, and that's Melbourne. Here's Melbourne. So I'm not, you know, that's how it is. It's called a perceptual map. So it's not actually a map, but if you look at the difference, these were all rated very incompatible, and they sort of clustered over here, those other ones clustered over there. So you start to look at that, you can see two dimensions coming out, unchanged and natural, and built and unchanged. So the historical features ended up here. This is all that new development. And it correlated directly with the scores. And then when you take the data that how they describe those, and you do this categorical principal component analysis, you see these vectors, these lines. Those are the kinds of descriptors people associated with it. So those ones I showed you there were beauty, natural features, vegetation, recreation, wildlife, as opposed to design concerns, problems, unfamiliar, commercial, Main Street. There's another town. This is Apollo Bay. The same structure came out. And you can see so then I was able to use that data across all the towns to develop typologies of character features, both positive and negative. Now, I know I'm running out of time, but vegetation came out to be very important in certain towns and on the projective map. So I actually did further studies that looked at just the perception of vegetation. I hired an ecologist to independently assess those on sort of an index like intactness and weediness and all that. And there was a very strong correlation between what people considered compatible and what the ecological value was, which they didn't know. I mean, intuitively they did. But you can see they're all this is indigenous vegetation, all very distinctive, all highly rated as compatible with character, and also strong agreement. You look at the ones that were rated the lowest. They're all weedy species, exotic weedy species. I mean, you know, Canariensis, palms, pampas grass, agapanthus, very weedy. Distinctive vegetation was a whole category in itself. Geologic features were very, very important. Where they, in practically every town there was some, but places like Port Campbell obviously were dominated by that. But you can see that all across all of those towns. Water bodies and water features and wetlands and the wildlife associated with those, that was very important. Beaches, obviously, that's the big attraction. That's why everybody's moving there, because of the water is an attraction. The beaches are an attraction. Wildlife, in every town I got wildlife coming out as very important to character. Vernacular architecture, and in that context it tended to be these little timber houses from the 50s and early 60s, and certain design attributes. They had that slanted roof, scallion roof it's called, and access to nature, like I mentioned before, was extremely important. So from people's neighborhoods, they wanted to be able to access nature, and these kinds of features that allowed that were very important. Houses set in vegetation, very important. They had high scores, as you can see, across all the towns. Obviously, bushfires are a problem, so there's a conflict here about how do you protect your house from bushfires and yet still have indigenous vegetation right up next to it. These are planning dilemmas. You have to look. Heritage features came out in all the towns, but in Port Fairy, it dominated. There are about 50 buildings that are listed as of heritage importance. And so, obviously, that's very much part of the character, and people identified it that way. Commercial developments that were considered compatible, and you can see some of those features. Again, some of the developments I showed you before. Accommodation facilities, hotels and whatnot, the same. And you see they range from really incompatible and strong agreement on that to very compatible. Roads were really important, and you can see some of the roads. The roads had a distribution too, where Aries Inlet and Lorne, some of this in Port Campbell, very out of character, but the ones where they were able to retain character. Views, obviously. Incompatible development. Every town, you can see those attributes that people in the focus groups in those 3 towns, they're represented across all of that and in the scores. Industrial development, and I know that, particularly here, I would say that, just driving over here, there's a lot of industrial areas, and how you integrate that into the town and the character is important, because they typically came out pretty low. Juxtaposition of old development and new, heritage buildings and new, how you sort of blend those. You can see some weren't considered very successful, others were. Hinterland views, or hinterland, that's sort of the regional. Multi-unit developments, they came out consistently. Developers were trying to max out, get as much as they could, and pushing the boundaries, and in some cases, pushing the development controls beyond what they actually were allowed to do. This one was called by the locals the penitentiary, and yet, it got a very low score. So I know we're running out of time, but these are just out of several hundred maps where people identified their neighborhoods and the character elements within their neighborhoods. It just shows, and I'm doing a whole bunch of research on this now, it just shows that everybody has a somewhat different idea of what their neighborhood is and why it is their neighborhood, what's important about it. So I took those descriptions that people wrote and I factor analyzed those. That means you sort of take the data and group it into several, reduce the data down. And it came out that natural and natural features were most important. Neighborhood boundaries, how the actual neighborhood was, whether through, natural or built boundaries, roads, rivers, homes and nearby areas, community services, shops. It's all about what makes neighborhood. From the community involvement, part-time residents, we're talking about that, With full-time residents, it was more their neighbors and their friends. That was quite interesting. Nearby areas and trails, again, that access to nature, quiet streets and local parks, and then change over time, friends and neighbors. The part-time residents were like, that's a big concern. Lack of traffic in commercial areas, the full-time residents. I'm going to just end with the business case for conserving town character. And these are just some things that I've noticed around the world. If you destroy the character of a place, you're going to impact on the tourism value. And that, in the Great Ocean Road case, means huge amounts of money, billions. So I would say that on the Indian Ocean Drive, which is, as I understand, relatively recent development, there's going to be this, it should attract a strong tourism industry. And this idea of the destination having a desirable character is often the major tourist attraction. And you see it when it's ruined. People go, ah, that place, the character's ruined. We'll go on to the next place, the next undiscovered place with character. You don't want that to happen because it actually means it's bad business. It means a decrease in tourism. Property values, people buy these places. In these places, they like living there because they have this great character. You destroy that, the property values go down. People go, I don't want to live there anymore. Character's been ruined. And sustainable development options, which, as you could see, things like the indigenous vegetation and whatnot require less energy, less maintenance, less water. So there are links between sustainable development and conservation of character for sustainable, environmental sustainability. So I think, planning implications, which is the last one. Encourage development and landscape changes that embody those positive attributes, obviously. And I would maintain that that's true here as well as Victoria. I found it in Thailand even. I was working in Koh Samui Island there. Tourism development was ruining the character. Similar, a little bit different. Discourage the negative attributes, particularly scale, design, architectural design, siting of new development and densities. Focus on individual sites and development applications and the relationships with others at a neighborhood scale. Appropriateness of landscape design proposals. Conservation of landscape features, particularly natural and heritage features, because they relate it to that. Strong controls on development that encourage the above without inhibiting design innovation. I think that's a really important point, because architects often listen to that and they go, because I work with a lot of architects, and they go, oh, you're telling us what to do, you're just ruining creativity and innovation. I'm saying, no, I'm giving you a whole list of attributes that you can then creatively play with that will help, that if you do it properly, you should be able to make that development be perceived as very compatible with the character. So don't just try to recreate the same thing and hold relics in time and recreate things that just resemble something else. Use the attributes in a creative way. The conclusion of it that I came up with is look at the landscape as a totality and then try to be compatible and blend with that. And then encourage developers to use these attributes from a town neighborhood character point of view in designing new developments. That's it. Yes. Thank you.